Ahead of this referendum, anticipating some of the divide it might cause, we saw an Indigenous helpline be set up, and it has been bombarded.
I think the referendum has had an impact. Our calls are going through the roof. A lot of the calls are saying that Aboriginal people feel overwhelmed. Our calls for the topic of racism and trauma are rising, and I believe that that is due to the referendum and the toxicity of the debate.
That's Arnie Marge Anderson. She's a Gamilaroi woman and the national manager of the 13 Yarn helpline, which sits within Lifeline. So as referendum day draws closer, the question is, has it been worth the cost, the personal cost? And how will Australia feel and how will it look after referendum day? Hi, I'm Fran Kelly, joining you from Gadigal land of the Eora Nation.
Hey, I'm Carly Williams. I'm a Quandamooka woman and the ABC's national Indigenous correspondent, also on Gadigal land in Sydney. This is the Voice Referendum Explained.
A symbolic declaration of war against modern Australia.
It's quite incomprehensible, quite frankly, and as I say, it sort of speaks to someone who hasn't even read the statement.
So in recent weeks, Carly, both sides have accused the other of being the wreckers in this campaign. Peter Dutton says Anthony Albanese's referendum has just divided the nation. And the Yes campaign say it's the disinformation being peddled by No that's caused the damage. But the Prime Minister says, despite all of that, it's all been worth it because it's kept the focus on Indigenous Australians.
At the same time, Australians are talking like never before about the gap that's there in life expectancy, about the fact that an Indigenous young male has a greater chance of going to jail than university, about health issues, about housing, about listening. And that process in itself is something that I believe is positive. The fact that we are talking about Indigenous disadvantage, not on the fringes, but on the front pages of newspapers.
Well, that's for sure. That's the Prime Minister speaking with Catherine Murphy for the Guardian podcast. But meanwhile, back at the 13 Yarn helpline, Arnie Marge says this really is taking a heavy toll.
My staff have particularly told me, yes, it has intensified for them. Like they go and do their grocery shopping and have people making snide remarks, as they're walking past. It's really becoming toxic out there for Aboriginal people, and not only because of the racism, it's because we're expected to be an expert on the voice. And so, well-meaning non-Aboriginal people are coming up to Aboriginal people and asking them about the voice and asking them for clarity. And they seem to think that we've got an electronic message stick that's secret, that we're getting more information than anybody else.
I'm hearing this a lot from Mob as well, regardless how they're voting. Gwenda Stanley is a Gomeroi woman. She's voting no, and she is the caretaker at the Aboriginal Tent Embassy in Canberra.
Well, you can't actually turn the television on or turn the radio on unless you're hearing about this campaign. And, it's quite disturbing to hear all these people that are coming out and having their opinions on us, about us, without us. We feel the impact of what's happening on social media and the reality of living as an Aboriginal person in this country. And if anything, this has actually exposed the continuous racism in this country.
But as the date draws closer, people are starting to think about how we're going to feel the day after the referendum.
If we vote yes in this referendum, we'll be seen as a modern democracy that has dealt with the legacies that have come from imperial nations taking countries away from Indigenous peoples. That's the first thing. And that we were courageous enough as a nation, of a modern nation, to deal with and face up to that particular matter by recognition in our constitution and by allowing the people that we've subjugated and oppressed a voice that is not binding on our parliament, but a voice that they can put to our parliament and to our executive on ways to improve that relationship between us and those that have conquered us. And it will also be seen as a matter of restorative justice. We can't go backwards, but we can be honest, we can face up to the legacy, and we can try to map out a future way, but this time in a dialogue with the First Peoples and give them a chance to say how we ought to do it.
That's Labor Senator and Yarra man Pat Dodson with his characteristic optimism and sense of hope. He's such a peacemaker, I think, for all of us. But, we've got to ask the question, Carly, what if Australia votes no?
Well, we'll just have to wait and see about that. But if there is a no, I think there will absolutely be international news coverage. I mean, the Voice referendum's already got a run on the New York Times and the BBC. I've had text messages from people overseas going, where is this going? Like, what's happening?
Yeah, Julie Bishop, she's a former foreign minister, of course, and she's still out and about on the international stage a lot. She's voting yes.
I have no doubt that it will be sending a very negative message about the openness and the empathy and the respect and responsibility that the Australian people have for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders.
So that's Julie Bishop, and her view is shared by John McCarthy, who's a career diplomat. In fact, he's been Australia's ambassador in 7 countries, most of them in our region.
I think in a longer term way, the manner in which we are regarded, the manner in which we are trusted, the manner in which people have confidence in us as a country, all that will be impacted. And I think in the end, the manner in which people regard us as a country does have long-term implications for all sorts of things, whether people visit in a funny subliminal way, whether they want to do business with us, the manner in which they trust us, regard us internationally, all that will come into play.
It's a bit confronting, Fran. People won't want to visit us in
Well,
Australia.
maybe that's the level he's talking about. I mean, it's fair to say he's not talking about terms of trade or anything on that level. But John McCarthy is adamant that a no vote would damage our relations with the Pacific.
There is considerable empathy amongst Pacific Islanders for Indigenous people in Australia, and they will take it very, very seriously. And this, I think, actually is quite important to our current strategic interests. We've put a real emphasis on the South Pacific over the past 3 or 4 years, partly because of fears of encroachment by China. Now, part of that means understanding the way people of the Pacific think, and the way we treat Indigenous people will be seen as directly relevant to the way Australians look to the South Pacific.
And Fran, any sort of nuance in this vote, the complexities on both sides will be completely lost in international coverage. All that's going to resonate and cut through is the headline. Australia votes against recognising Indigenous Australians. So if it is a no vote and the polls are suggesting that it will be a no vote, what happens then?
What's the government's plan? Well, I don't think there is one yet. They're certainly not engaging on that level yet. The Prime Minister, the Minister for Indigenous Australians, Linda Burney, have right through refused to engage on the issue of what happens if it's a no. They're remaining staunchly positive. They're full on in their push for a yes vote. That's where they are right now. But, as you say, as the polls continue to slide, others are thinking about the future and they are urging the government to be prepared. Among them, Indigenous academic Marcia Langton. Marcia's the co-author of the Langton Karma Report, which was really the report that's given us the only model we have at all so far on what they were looking at, what a legislative voice might look like. When she spoke at the National Press Club just a few weeks ago, she had some, let's say, free and frank advice for the Prime Minister.
I do hope that the government sets out an agenda for reform that's based on common sense, on the recommendations of many inquiries and royal commissions, and on expert advice before the rabble take over and turn a no vote into a mandate to cause us even further harm. If the government is not inclined to set out the agenda before the vote, then they should do so immediately afterwards, and that means they should be prepared now to tell us what the future holds for us.
That's Marcia Langton putting the government on notice.
But what is the plan? What's the strategy? Because there's been calls to legislate a voice. The government shuts that down. What are the odds that they backflip and go there?
I think a legislative voice is unlikely because if you think about it, if the Prime Minister, the day after the country voted no, said, oh, well, we're going to move forward with a legislated voice, I think he'd be accused of ignoring the will of the people. Now, the only caveat there would be if, say, Peter Dutton stepped up with an olive branch and said, okay, let's do this together. That might be different. But I don't think it's going to be a legislated voice. I really can't see that happening. The number one priority, the reality is, for most Australians right now, is cost of living and the pressures people are feeling.
Paying the bills.
Yeah, paying the bills, that's it. And I think after this referendum day, the government is going to want to reset and prove to the population that, you know, it's totally focused there on their everyday cost of living needs.
Yeah, I get that. This is why Marcia Langton, I understand, is worried that Indigenous affairs is going to be left behind and forgotten about a little bit.
Exactly. And I think she's right to some extent, because certainly Indigenous affairs won't be front and centre as it is right now. But the PM, you know, I'm sure will want to try and keep faith with Indigenous Australians. I guess he'll address the nation after the vote, whichever way it goes, and have some kind of action plan to try and work on improving the disadvantage that we heard him talking about earlier. Something, I imagine less permanent, something less consultative than the voice, but maybe in that frame, maybe some kind of committee that he can set up to advise him on matters. I don't know. But remember, Carly, it was just a few weeks before all this kicked off, really, in the official campaign, that the Productivity Commission came out and gave the states and territories an absolute shellacking for their failure on implementing the closing the gap targets and the whole process.
Roasted them, said the government had dropped the balls, not meeting those closing the gap targets. The government can't ignore closing the gap data.
No, and the Productivity Commission's main beef with the states and territories was that they'd failed in their pledge to work with Indigenous communities. So, you know, that's kind of in line with what the Voice is all about. So, you know, who knows, maybe the Prime Minister will call National Cabinet together, get those state and territory leaders around the table and say, come up with a better plan. You've got to do better on closing the gap targets. Certainly that's an idea that Pat Dodson thinks could be the way to go.
If Australia votes no in this referendum, then we would have to take stock of our position as a mature modern democracy. We will have failed in the legacy issues that colonisation has bequeathed to us, in the settlement issues that colonisation has also bequeathed to us, in the denial of the First Peoples of this country. But if we fail, then I think the Federation has got to come together, as we do through the meeting of Prime Ministers and leaders from states and territories, and reassess. Okay, how does the nation go forward in other ways? And then there are other possibilities, and some of the states are showing leadership in that direction with their own voices and treaty commissions, etc.
That's true. It's worth remembering that most of the states and territories do have some kind of commitment to a treaty process. Still a long way to go on some fronts, but they seem committed. A federal treaty is a different thing. As we said in the podcast last week, a federal treaty is a process that would have taken decades anyway. And I reckon if there's a no vote, the idea of a national treaty is off the table for now.
And remember, Fran, a national treaty doesn't sit well with heaps of mob anyway. Like Gwenda Stanley was saying, Gomeroi woman from the Aboriginal 10 Embassy in Canberra, she's voting no. She says for treaties to work best, it should be at the local level.
It's nation building, and it needs to be the clans of the nations to make that decision on what they want. No one treaty can actually determine any other clan or nation's determination for what they see as their own clan treaties. And, you know, again, if we try to do that, we're going to fail our people on the ground and just another bickering and fight and division amongst our own.
And I know we talked about this last week, Carly, but I can't stress it enough. This referendum is not about a treaty, is it?
I feel like we all need reminding. This referendum is not on treaties, national treaties or state treaties. This referendum is about recognising Indigenous Australians in the Constitution with a voice to Parliament.
And leaders like Marcia Langton, who we heard from today, and others who have heard from across this podcast series, you know, Megan Davis, Noel Pearson, Arnie Pat Anderson, you know, they've devoted a huge part of their lives to get to this moment.
Long time, yeah.
If the nation votes no, you'd have to really wonder whether they're going to saddle up again.
That is a big worry for some leaders, including Owen Cole. He's from Mbarntwa, Alice Springs. He's a Luritja Marawangu man, and he is worried about that.
I'm just frightened of the fact that a large sector of the Aboriginal community will be that demoralised, and many of the elders will retreat from play an influential role that they do in politics, and they'll just say it's just not worth it. We've given our utmost and it's failed, and we'll retreat. So I'm just afraid that people are going to wave the white flag and walk away and say that we're never going to beat this Australian system. It's unfair. You know, the old mantra that everyone gets a fair go in Australia, that is, except if you're Aboriginal, and this will just say to people, we just want to disappear, exit stage left.
It's a worry. It's a real worry. There has been an impact on First Nations Australians. I think whichever way the vote goes, especially if those lifeline phone numbers are anything to go by, we have been hurt. This has caused damage. So whichever way the vote goes, the government needs a plan, Fran. Wouldn't you agree? And something like to care for Indigenous Australians after this campaign, after this vote.
Well, I guess as always, the government needs to be mindful of what Indigenous Australians are telling them, and that's going to be one of the messages they're getting, isn't it? Yeah. So that'll be something, I guess, for around that national cabinet table. So that's it from us. Next week is the final week of this referendum campaign, so next episode is our final episode before you cast your ballot.
Thanks for listening. This is the Voice Referendum Explained. Listen to us on the ABC Listen app. We're also filming this, so catch us on iView. Just search the Voice Referendum Explained. See you next week, Fran. We're getting close.
See you, Carly.